This is Under the Lens, featuring economic research by Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. The content of this presentation is strictly the opinion of Gordon T. Long and is based on facts he feels to be accurate as a result of his research at this time. All listeners are advised to independently verify all research for market changes. The following opinions are not in any way a solicitation for business, nor should they be considered investment advice. You should always consult a registered investment advisor before making investment decisions. Now, let's join Gordon for today's show.
Good morning. It's Thursday, October the 18th, 2012. I'm Gord Long at GordonTLong.com. As usual, I have a lot of charts for us to go through this morning, so therefore I will pass over some of them quickly and leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You'll need to open your viewer to full screen viewing or you'll not be able to see some of the detail I'll be discussing. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. The purpose of the audio is to discuss key developments in those areas not specifically updated in this month's research report document. The research report document this month focuses on the non-U.S. macro developments from a regional perspective. Therefore, I'll focus the slides this morning on global risks and tipping points. Since we are focused solely on the U.S. in next month's global macro tipping point, we will limit that discussion somewhat today because of time. What I want to discuss here this morning specifically is the following. One, I want to discuss the seminal event that occurred in September, and I'm not talking about quantitative easing unlimited and OMT uncapped. They are only part of it. The other has gotten almost no coverage, but is just as critical, if not more. Secondly, warnings that we continue to see, and they're frankly accelerating. 3, key indicators of particular note. And 4, something important which I think everybody should be watching from a global perspective. We're in the midst of a race to debase, or a race to the bottom, amongst fiat currencies that has been going on for some time now. Last month, however, we took it to another level with the historic positions taken by the U.S. Federal Reserve and the ECB to go to unlimited and uncapped liquidity injections. With the Fed using unemployment levels of below 7% as a target to end this ridiculousness, which we will likely never see ever again, it means an era has begun of endless money expansion. Once we stepped onto this accelerating treadmill, this outcome was preordained, as is the eventuality of a complete fiat currency collapse, in my humble opinion. As von Mises has told us decades ago, and I quote, "There is no means of avoiding the final collapse of a boom brought about by credit expansion. The alternative is only whether the crisis should come sooner as a result of voluntary abandonment of further credit expansion, or later as a final and total catastrophe of the current system involved." His wise words have proven the test of time in history and have never failed, and I see no reason that it should be different this time. As a matter of fact, we've probably taken it to greater extremes than has ever been done before, other than maybe a few exceptions in the Weimar Republic. Zimbabwe jumped quickly to my mind. That is not what I want to focus on here. I will discuss quantitative easing 3 and OMT in our written reports. I want to talk about the seminal event. Let me give you just a little bit of background here. When we took the U.S. off the gold standard, we were in the throes of our first oil crisis. Lineups at the pump and crushing debt from Vietnam and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and guns and butter, which led to the removal of the United States from the gold standard in August of 1971. What was less visible than removing the United States from the gold standard was what was going on behind the scenes in parallel. And that was a very critical, strategic set of negotiations that took place and agreements were reached that were negotiated by Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State under President Richard Nixon, with the less visible involvement of big oil through specifically George Bush Sr., later President of the United States, and James Baker, later the Secretary of State. Since then, for decades now, most of the nations of the world have used the U.S. dollar to buy oil and to trade with each other. In essence, the U.S. dollar has been acting as a true global currency. The idea of which really stemmed from the Bretton Woods Agreement in post-Second World War that the United States would be the global reserve currency. But it's one thing to be the global reserve currency, it's another to actually be the global currency. Virtually every country on the face of the earth has needed big piles of U.S. dollars for international trade. This has ensured a huge demand for U.S. dollars, and not as visibly obvious, but also large amounts of U.S. government debt. This demand for dollars has kept prices and interest rates low, and it has given the U.S. government an incredible amount of power and leverage around the globe. Right now, U.S. dollars make up more than 60% of all foreign currency reserves in the world. But these times are changing. Over the past couple of years, there has been a large number of new international agreements that have made the U.S. dollar less important in international trade. The mainstream media in the United States has been strangely quiet about all these agreements. But the truth is that they are setting the stage for a fundamental shift in the way that trade is conducted around the globe, and that is now in full motion. Quietly and with stealth, but nevertheless occurring, and with it will be significant changes and instability. When the petrodollar dies, it is going to have an absolutely devastating impact on the U.S. economy. Sadly, most Americans are totally clueless regarding what is about to happen to the United States dollar. One of the reasons the Federal Reserve has been able to get away with flooding the financial system with U.S. dollars is because the rest of the world has been soaking up a lot of those dollars. The rest of the world has needed giant piles of dollars to trade with. But what is going to happen when they simply don't need as many dollars anymore? A simple shift from 60% of the world's reserves being U.S. dollars to, let's say, 45% is profound. Even 55% down from 60% is absolutely profound, and the implications to hyperinflation or elevated inflation in the United States as all these dollars are brought home, are sent home, or are sent for claims, will be significant. Could we see a tsunami of inflation as demand for the dollars plummets like a rock? Absolutely. Frankly, the petrodollar system was a brilliant political and economic move. It forced the world's oil money to flow through the United States Federal Reserve, creating ever-growing international demand for both U.S. dollars and U.S. debt, while essentially letting the U.S. pretty much own the world's oil for free, since oil's value is denominated in a currency that America controls and prints. The petrodollar system spread beyond oil. The majority of international trade has been done in U.S. dollars. But this was as the United States was also a dominant global exporter. That has changed in the last decade. So we have a couple major shifts that have happened. That means that from Russia to China, Brazil to Korea, every country aims right now to maximize U.S. dollar surplus garnered from export trade to buy oil, currently, or has been happening. The U.S. has reaped many rewards. As oil usage increased in the 1980s, demand for the U.S. dollar rose with it, lifting the U.S. economy to new heights. But even without economic success at home, the U.S. dollar would have soared because the petrodollar system created consistent international demand for the U.S. dollar, which in turn gained in value. A strong U.S. dollar allowed Americans to buy imported goods at a massive discount. The petrodollar system essentially created a subsidy for U.S. consumers at the expense of the rest of the world. Here, finally, the U.S. is hit on a downside. The availability of cheap imports hit the U.S. manufacturing industry hard, and the disappearance of manufacturing jobs remains one of the biggest challenges in resurrecting the U.S. economy. You can't have it all, and that's the underpinnings of this tremendous petrodollar system. It has actually undermined our ability to create cheap imports and costs of labor. It was only a matter of time, and matter of fact, the time has been long past. The power of the U.S. dollar has been one of the few things holding up our economy. Once that leg is kicked out from under us, we are going to be in a whole lot of trouble. Listed here are 11 international agreements that frankly are nails in the coffin of the petrodollar. Now here is the major event that happened on September the 4th. Just prior to the hurried announcements of QE3 unlimited and OMT in Europe uncapped as they accelerated their printing, and this is how China and Russia reacted. And here's a quote from the China Daily about this critically important agreement, again, which is only one of the 10 others that I'm listing here. China and Russia have decided to renounce the U.S. dollar and resort to using their own currencies for bilateral trade. Premier Wen Jiabo and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, announced on Tuesday, September the 4th. Chinese experts said the move reflected closer relationships between Beijing and Moscow and is not aimed at challenging the dollar, but to protect their domestic economies. About trade settlement, we have decided to use our own currencies, Putin said at a joint news conference with Wen in St. Petersburg. The two countries were accustomed to using other currencies, especially the dollar, for bilateral trade. Since the financial crisis, however, high-ranking officials on both sides began to explore other possibilities. That's a quote right from the Chinese Daily. A specialist in international politics at the Renmin University of China said the proposal is not challenging the dollar, but aimed at avoiding the risks the dollar represents. A lot of spin going on here to show that it is not a challenge to the U.S. dollar, but to minimize risks. It's a nice way of padding it, but what they're doing is setting up and finishing the complete end run of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. This has absolutely, as I've just pointed out earlier, profound implications that the media has not even begun to explore. Do not forget for one moment the whole concept of peak oil. I'm not trying to espouse peak oil here this morning, but I'm simply saying that for years now, demand growth around the globe has been outstripping our supply growth of bringing on and discovering new oil resources and the ongoing significant depletion rate of existing oil reserves. And therefore, what we see is a crunch that, if happens, will spike oil. And right now, we've actually seen short-term price pressures on oil. And if we ever get up much higher, we've seen before the devastating impact it would have to the globe and specific to the United States in terms of recession, which we are either in right now or just bordering right on. So, very critical time. It is currently, besides a geopolitical event that may spring from this, it is currently the world's biggest risk exposure in my opinion. Now, what's going on also in parallel with it is we have escalating tensions in the Middle East. Right now, if we really look at it, the only area in the Middle East that can sell oil in anything other than U.S. dollars is Iran, who we now face embargoes on. And if you look at this map, certainly says that if you were Iran, you'd feel somewhat threatened at this point in time. But they're doing everything possible not to take the bait that's being put in front of them by the United States to create an event that, in fact, will make their area another yellow strip as shown on this map. Let's be clear about who's threatening who here before we get a little too patriotic. How would Americans feel if Iran had stationed troops and aircrafts on the Mexican and Canadian borders and conducted military excursions into American territory, including funding and training armed dissidents to overthrow the American government, as opposed to Iran in 1953 when America overthrew a democratically elected Iranian government and exposed a dictatorship there? Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to support Iran. I'm just trying to point out that clearly we're trying to provoke something here. For good reasons or bad, that's what's going on. Call it a false flag event that we need, but it certainly would make a huge difference to this problem right now. It's not that we want the oil. As I've said, the trading of the oil in U.S. dollars and restricting it. And therefore, if any of the BRIC countries who are now creating these bilateral agreements want oil, the only major supply source is, in fact, selling it in U.S. dollars. Now, Russia has a lot of oil, but it'll be a question of whether it'll be sufficient to really offload the tremendous demand growth. And frankly, my opinion is emphatically not enough. Iran is not likely to attack either the United States or Israel. So when it comes to drawing the red lines as Netanyahu did and before the United Nations, is his precursor to making sure that when this happens, this event, that Israel was on the right side of the United Nations in quite a memorable speech that he made before the United Nations. If a major event occurs, the ramifications will be very interesting. But one of the things that's clear is that we have always used the liquidity injections of the Federal Reserve to offset any sudden shocks to the system, as this chart clearly shows. But we're out of ammunition. So any major shock to the system now, the bucket is empty to fight the next fire. It's short of taking ourselves into completely and totally unprecedented water. So it's a little worrying. The other thing that's very worrying to myself right now is the United States debt is being basically funded with being printed by the United States Federal Reserve on $1.5 trillion is close to $1.2 trillion thereabouts, approximate figures, has been bought by the Federal Reserve, printed. Well, that's got to change. But who's going to buy the even larger debt that will occur this year and next year? Well, the answer has been primarily the new debt is being bought by Japan and to a lesser degree UK, in that they have increased their already large amounts, while China and Russia have stopped, in Russia's cases, is selling. So there's this big gap, but Japan has in fact been picking up the bulk of it. And the question I have is, how can the biggest debtor in the world, which is Japan, which even the IMF is warning about its sustainability, it's got a net balance of trade now that's negative for the very first time, has clearly, with over 500% total debt to GDP, never mind sovereign debt, well up over 220%. Where is it getting the money to, in fact, buy ever-expanding amounts of U.S. debt? Obviously, what we have here is a dramatic Ponzi scheme. As we learned from Bernie Madoff, Ponzi schemes end awfully badly. This chart nicely quantifies the 6 downsides and 2 upside risks to global markets. While much attention has been paid to what Draghi has talked about doing and what Bernanke is doing, what EU leaders are not doing, and what U.S. politicians will not do, the world's risk markets remain clearly on edge. Admittedly, for now, that edge seems biased to the we believe side of the fence. However, as this Deutsche Bank chart shows, in comparing the impact and probability of potential upside and downside risks to the global markets, it is economic or real data that should worry investors the most, though we still feel the denial stage that is here, in which Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Greece remain mired in. Global growth, as I've pointed out many times before, is slowing and slowing dramatically, and it's my opinion we actually, in real terms, are in contraction, never mind minor levels of nominal growth. And the IMF came out with some very, very strong warnings here recently, and to quote them, it will surely take at least a decade for the world economy to get back to decent shape, end of quote. It is a somewhat shockingly honest outlook from the IMF, which is worrying in itself when the IMF starts to get this straightforward in its talk. It must be obviously very worried. It also said that, quote, Japan is facing a very difficult fiscal adjustment, end of quote. I think this is more an understatement of the facts than a forecast, but on the bright side, it says that China has turned the corner on its asset boom, but faces slower growth ahead. The reality that IMF is pointing out is a debt reduction via either default or deleveraging, and that this can be done without stifling growth is unavoidable. All eyes are on Spain ahead of the European Council's 2-day meeting in Brussels, which begins here today. In just 3 short years, the country's horrendous housing bust and subsequent recession have caused government debt to increase from a sustainable 40% of GDP in 2008 to 70% of, at least official, of GDP in 2011, and much, much higher if you put the regional governments of Spain, which are now in tremendous trouble, on the book, along with other contingent liabilities that are not accounted for. It's much, much higher. Despite the brutal government spending cuts, by the end of the year, the IMF forecasts government debt will be 90% of GDP based on their current 70%. if you believe even the official numbers. The question of whether Spain will seek a bailout preoccupies the markets and the policymakers alike, and I think it's preordained. The issue is just whether they can get the ESM in place fast enough right now, and the agreements of which they're discussing here in the next 2 days of having a EU banking union along with more centralized budgeting powers. I encourage our listeners to try this Economist's interactive graphic that allows you to play around with what you think are realistic estimates of growth and to see the impacts of the debt. And the Economist put it out because what the politicians are saying just makes absolutely no sense. And you play around with this chart for about 10 or 15 minutes, putting in just minor kinds of assumptions, and it shows that it's impossible. There's a massive bailout immediately that needs to be brought to bear here. Keeping all things equal, Spain would need to grow by 7.7% a year. Just almost total impossibility. Or nominal bond yields to fall to a teutonic 0.5%, from well north of 7%, to stabilize government gross debt at its 2011 level of 70% of GDP. Fat chance. The IMF, as a benchmark, forecasts that the GDP growth will average 0.5% a year and bond yields 7.7% between 2012 and 2017. Frankly, I wonder if anybody is realistically paying attention to the magnitude of the disconnect that we have here. It just refuses to get any better in Spain, whose banks are now aggressively marking down real estate to something resembling fair value. Last month's Spanish bad loans jumped by the most ever, rising by over 1% to just over 10.1%. But the worst news is that the August bad loan total just hit a fresh record of 178 billion, or 10.5% of the total 1.7 billion euro mark in bank loans. Making this worse is that primary bank funding lifeline deposits continue to flow out, that both Spain and its banking sector are utterly insolvent. As a percentage of GDP, this would be equivalent to roughly 2.7 trillion in U.S. bank loans going sour. We'd better get more than just talk out of this 20th summit meeting, which has brought so far, in my opinion, nothing. As for the other marginal peripheral country, Italy, things aren't any better on the ground there either. Deposits held by foreigners in Italy continue to fall, although at a slower pace than in previous months, but in August they declined to 15.4 compared to 17% fall in the month earlier. Loans to non-financial businesses and families fell 2.6%, the fifth straight monthly decline and the most deterioration in the last 2 years. Also, bad loans rose due to Italy's recession, which they're clearly in. In September, they totaled nearly 116 billion euros, up 15.6% from a year earlier. So things in Italy are also deteriorating at an accelerating rate. The global misery indices have generally never been higher. Europe's misery index has continued to rise in the face of an ever-easing ECB and political jawboning. The Eurozone's misery index has never been higher. These indices clearly reflect deteriorating economic performance in the main G10 countries, with some unsurprisingly weaker performance in Spain and Greece, leading the Eurozone index higher. Given recessionary situations expected in some Eurozone countries next year, the misery index is unfortunately quite unlikely to edge south significantly. The situation in the Eurozone deteriorated further during the summer. The unemployment rate hit a record 11.4% in August, while inflation increased from 2.4 to 2.6 year over year, pushing the Eurozone misery index to a record 14%. With unfortunately dark employment outlook, the index is unlikely to reverse course sharply anytime soon. This will force the ECB to get an ultra-accommodative stance for some time to come. And we can see the U.S. misery index, the U.K. misery index are also a concern. So with all this risk out there, what do we see with complacency? Here we have Citi's macro risk aversion index, which just tested record lows, record high complacency levels with regard to investors' view of a macro uncertainty going forward. Coinciding as it did with Bernanke's all-in moment, we wonder if we just saw the peak complacency moment as the wall of worry was officially scaled, only to find that the grass is indeed not greener on the other side. For sure, it would appear that all the talk of bearish sentiment as a driver of the next secular leg in stock seems just that, talk. I've been warning about PEs, but do we have peak PE right now? There is little doubt that asset prices have responded to central bank promises and actions. Even as bottom-up fundamentals are clearly fading, top-down index normal prices rise on the back of magical multiple expansion, which is defended from on high by sell-side strategists the world over on the back of a recovery is just around the corner. The trouble is there's a limit, and it seems from QE2 and Litro that we are rapidly approaching that limit. And with earnings outlooks being reversed lower, perhaps we are at peak PE for this cycle of quantitative easing. I've spelled this out in gory detail in the monthly MATA document and in the audio. It's very, very clear when you go through the magnitude of charts that we go through. We have glaring divergences right across the board, chart after chart after chart. That I look at and examine, I see the kinds of things that I'm showing here, just as representative examples. We have just completely disconnected, and that is fundamentally based on the belief that printing money is just going to drive markets higher, and therefore disconnecting from the basic realities of the global economies. And this will go on, as we've seen in the past. But when it breaks, and it does break, it breaks dramatically and violently. There's always something that is generally considered the catalyst for the break, whether it'll be a default of financial impact, a geopolitical event, a false flag. It's hard to say, but know that it will be something. One situation that could come out of nowhere is something you need to keep your eye on, and charts I'm showing here on global food prices. We've had droughts, we've had all sorts of issues with crop problems this year. We have higher and higher demand for food. It's an old story. But food prices have exploded. And you may be in previous era in the developed world where disposable incomes were relatively all right. Now with crushing disposable income, any increase in food is going to have a profound impact, which will lead to social unrest, has been proven time and time again. But if you get to the developing world, food is a disproportionately higher level of disposable income. And any kind of shifts in food are politically destabilizing. And right now, we have food moving at staggering rates higher, and it's the number one concern of China right now. So keep your eye clearly on this going forward. Let me close by saying and taking a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments are, there have seldom been better times for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. So until we talk again, may 2012 be an outstanding investment year for you. Thank you.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.